3.
Done.
Are we? Yeah, we are recording now. Okay, hi guys. My name is Taha Iqbal, and I will be talking about extensions. If at any point my voice isn't loud enough, or if there's a glitch, and you can't hear me, or I get stuck, just feel free to, signal through video, or I guess just put it down in the chat. Um, this is the way I'm going to go about this session. The first thing I'm going to discuss is what is an extension, what counts as an extension. The second thing I'm going to discuss is how do we create an extension? How do we make an extension? What are the strategic choices that you and your partner need to make to pull off an extension? And the third thing I want to talk about in specific are extension speeches, so CG member and CO member speeches, and how to go about them. To the first one, I don't propose spending much time on this. I think we'll clarify that through questions later on as well. But what is an extension? Basically, an extension isn't necessarily a new contribution. What an extension is an improved contribution from the closing half in the debate. It can happen through multiple means. One, it could be through new framing. So for instance, there are examples of you saying, aha, openings have talked about a context in which they're only discussing developed countries. Perhaps this problem is more pervasive in developing countries, and the context over there is dissimilar. The actors in it are dissimilar, and you're basically introducing new characterization, a new frame, and that can count as an extension. Even if the arguments are the same, if the impacts of the arguments are different, it can count as an extension. The second thing is obviously, and this is what I think most debaters strive for, which isn't necessarily a good thing, is bringing about new arguments in extension. So an entirely new piece of content that has been missed by openings can also be an extension. And the third thing is, and this is far more common, is analysis extensions, whereby you recognize that there are certain things that opening half has missed, and you add in mechanisms, therefore explaining why the premises of their arguments are true, solidifying their arguments, and therefore taking their impacts. The fourth kind of extension is rebuttal extension. I think this is very undervalued, especially in the Pakistani circuit, where if you have only rebuttals as extension, then people are like, well, this isn't valuable enough, you're not winning the debate. But in a scenario where, for instance, you are CG and OO has comprehensively beaten OG, you can reasonably take it over both OO and OG if you can rebut OO and make sure that their case falls. And by extension, you can also then therefore show that OG's case stands. So rebuttal extensions are obviously mixed usually with mechanism and so on. But yes, rebuttal extensions can work. There's no need to shy away from them. The last kind of extension is basically new weighing. Oftentimes what happens in opening, and I'm going to talk about this in detail later on, is what's called a deadlock, whereby oftentimes what you will have is a very comprehensive case from opening government giving you benefit X, and a very comprehensive case from opening opposition giving you harm Y. But the problem is for the judge, there is no way for them to determine whether benefit X is better or harm Y is worse. And closing half teams can oftentimes just weigh these arguments and give a contribution to the debate and take it over their openings. So 5 things that I've discussed over here, I'm just going to signpost them again. What can be counted as an extension? 1, new framing. 2, new argument. 3, new analysis through mechanisms. 4, new rebuttal. And 5, new weighing. Hopefully this is clear. This is just the first part of the whole talk. Let's move on to the second part, which is how do we come up with extension material? How do we create extension material? The first thing over here that I want to discuss is prep. What do you do in prep time to ensure that you have a chance at winning a debate if you are closing? For people who are novices or new to the activity, oftentimes this is a very anxious moment where you're like, oh, if opening takes our arguments, what do we do? We have nothing to fall back on. So the first thing I want to say is, in prep, never panic. The benefit of always being in closing, and the reason why Hamza, who's also watching, and I always usually prefer closing, is because closings have this advantage whereby they don't have 15 minutes of prep. They have more like something like 30 to 45 minutes of prep, an advantage that isn't afforded to your opening half. Um, what do you do in prep? The purpose of prep in when you're closing half is very different to the purpose of prep when you're in opening half. In opening half, you're obviously focusing on, okay, what's the main clash? Let's build an argument, come up with one or two ideas which are, the strongest ideas in the debate, impact them, weigh them, win the debate, make it as clear as possible, introduce metrics, all of that sort of stuff. In closing half, the first question that you need to ask yourself, and I think this is the most useful thing, but also the thing that teams miss the most, is just read the motion slowly, understand what the clashes are and what the burdens on different teams are. What is the motion asking for prop to prove or opposition to prove, and what happens if you prove it? Do you win the debate? I think this makes things a lot clearer in terms of the arguments that you are going to be coming up with. The first question always needs to be, what do I need to prove to win this debate? Now, this is not going to be perfect always. You're not always going to come up with, aha, this is the metric, this is what we need to prove, and henceforth we will win the debate. Obviously, debates evolve. You are not a perfect human being. You're not a robot who can predict things into the future. Oftentimes, decisions need to be made on the fly when you're in closing, and you have to see how the debate progresses for you to strategically decide which piece of content you want to run, which piece of content you don't want to run. So that's the first thing. Burdens. This makes your job a lot easier. Why does it make your job a lot easier? Because if your opening government misses out on something and you believe that this is the burden of the debate, it just automatically makes sense because your strategic call is right there. This is the piece of content I need to run. This is why it's taking it over opening. So it just clarifies lots of things. The second thing you need to come up with is a breadth of argumentation. And what I mean over here is come up with as many ideas as possible without developing any of them. This means that if you have taglines, say, if it's a debate about, rights or something, you can come up with, a set of principal arguments about agency, for instance, or something about, consequences about what happens if X, Y, Z, or so on and so forth. And there are multiple consequentialist arguments that you can come up with. Come up with like 4 or 5, or how many, you can come up with. Sometimes it's going to be a very tough motion and you won't be able to come up with something. Even then, just don't panic. What you basically need to do is, on your sheet of paper when you're just prepping, don't make your speech. What you need to do is simply just jot down these ideas so that when you're in the room, you and your partner can then decide which piece of content has not been run by opening, for instance, or which piece of content has basically been bungled up by opening. That's the second thing that you need to do in prep. Come up with as many things as possible. The third thing then, after prep is done, and the crucial bit to an extension, which I think lots of people miss, is listening to the debate. Your prep is basically just halfway done after prep time finishes. What you need to look at, and this is the advice I'll give to you for coming up with important pieces of analysis as opposed to just new pieces of analysis, is make sure you are listening to what opening government and opening opposition are saying, and make sure that you are trying to listen to it not as a person who is going to speak for CG or CO, but as a judge. And this sort of thinking or frame of mind oftentimes makes a huge difference. So when you're a judge, if you've ever judged a debate, what you will oftentimes think about is, but this team missed this sort of thing, and that's why their case is weak, even if the other team perhaps didn't point it out. So if you are trying to judge the opening half, you will automatically find out loopholes in opening government. Like if you're CG, then that's obviously useful, or you will find out the loopholes in opening opposition. What are the benefits of this? The first thing over here is, if opening government misses a mechanism, then you will realize that you need to put those mechanisms in. The second thing is, let's assume it's a debate where opening opposition has said something, opening government has very reasonably missed it. Say, for instance, there's a rebuttal that comes up in DLO, but opening government has no chance to, obviously respond. But that rebuttal is key and it's actually beating their case. Now you as extension speaker, or you as the closing team, need to realize that this rebuttal and taking down this rebuttal is the most important thing that you need to do in the debate, so that you can bring up you can basically just come up in your speech and say, look, OG had a fine case, but this rebuttal from O basically just destroys their case, or destroys their impacts, or nullifies whatever they're trying to say, or mitigates it very severely to the point that their impacts are marginal. What we are now going to do is just show to you why this response doesn't make sense, or why this response sorry, I'll just try to stay closer to the mic. Thank you for that. Why this response then uh, is better tackled by your team. So the judging bit is key. The third thing I'd suggest is talking to your partner. Never be in the habit of leaving your whip just guessing about what the extension is going to be. Um, Always talk to your partner after speeches are done, ideally, because you want to still listen to the speeches that are happening. What I mean by this is, after PM is done, 7 minutes of them are done. Obviously, there's going to be a time gap where LO has not come up. And if LO has not come up, and there's obviously going to be time gaps within every speech that happens, consequently, you need to discuss very quickly, okay, they've said this, this is our response to this, or this is what they have missed, this is what I'm going to take through. Um, Before your extension speech, basically, if you're extension speaker, you need to have a chat with your whip about what you are running and be clear about what you are running and develop it. The third thing with regards to your partner is, you also need to divide roles effectively. Now, obviously, if you're going extension, you will not have the time to listen to the speech that's happening right before you. So what you need to do basically at that point is say to your partner, you are in charge of doing POIs, you are in charge of tracking the speech thoroughly. And if there is something that I have missed, if there is something that has come up that is new that needs to be immediately responded to, you are going to tell me, or you are going to take care of it, however that works. But that communication is key. Without that communication, you will oftentimes miss out on things, or you will just end up confusing your whip, and then they'll have basically no idea what they're going to do in terms of whip. So that's just how you utilize prep, how you utilize a debate for the things that you can do. People oftentimes find it very easy to do things like color coding, where they're like, blue pen for OG and red pen for OO. That helps them keep track of the debate. I'm not going to give you suggestions on how you should keep notes. That's obviously a very personal thing. Whatever suits you, you should do it. But what I will caution against is writing down everything, because I've also noticed people going to the other end of the extreme. Some people just don't listen, but other people just listen too intently, whereby they're oftentimes just writing down everything OG has said. This is the definition, this is the argument, blah, blah, blah. That's also wasting a lot of time. Don't do that. Jot down the most important bits, and just look at the debate through like a meta lens, as opposed to getting too involved within the debate. Again, look at it through the lens of a judge, ideally. That's what you should do when you're prepping, or when you're in on the debate floor. What should you then do to extend? What is a valuable extension? How do you win on extensions? The first thing over here, and I've said this at the start of the session, is there is a misconception that new pieces of content will win you the debate. It is entirely possible that you can come up with a new piece of content, an argument that is amazing, for instance, or very well built, but that argument just does nothing in the debate. Your job as closing is not to become Einsteins and like come up with like fucking inventions and try to tell people that, oh, look, we're so smart, and this is the new idea that we brought. And I've noticed this, by the way, on the Pakistani circuit a lot, where people are just like, oh, we've brought this new piece of analysis, so we win. That is the worst reason for you to bring a piece of content in. And this is actually the best litmus test that you should be running. If you have a mechanism that, and the only way for you to justify why you take it over your opening is to say that this is a new mechanism, then that is a bad mechanism. Unless you can find out reasons for why strategically it is a good mechanism, it outweighs certain things in the debate, it clarifies certain things in the debate, it makes the impact bigger. You need to come up with objective reasons, as opposed to this arbitrary reason of this is new content, to come up with a good extension. New things are not always good things. They can be good things, but just be cautious about this. So that's the first thing I need to clarify. What are common things that happen in opening half? And over here, I'm also going to answer the questions that I got in the sheet, because some of the questions were like, what happens if opening burns everything? The first thing I would say is, That just very rarely happens. They have 15 minutes like you. It is impossible for them usually, unless it's a very shallow motion and edge scores messed up, for them to burn everything in the debate. Or if they're having, I don't know, like they're having their bow save moment, and they're like, okay, we're legends right now. At that point, you can't do much, and then you happily do the rebuttal extension bit and try to take the strategic second, which I'll get to later on. Um, but but usually they will not burn it. If you think that they've burned it, like I can say it with a lot of certainty that they haven't. There's something that they have missed. You haven't listened closely enough, or you aren't thinking strategically enough to realize what it is. um, One way of analogizing this is, if you've ever been in an IR debate, and Hamza and I have been in many, where oftentimes what we do as opening is we burn all the consequentialist stuff. We burn the stuff about, we talk about, okay, if you go to war over here, maybe some rebel proxy group happens up, or maybe war is the only thing, blah, blah, blah. All of this sort of stuff we burn in opening. Or it's something like an actor motion where it's like, the Republican Party should do X, Y, Z, and we always take the consequentialist stuff. But you will always notice, like, closing half oftentimes comes up with this argument where they're like, what is the moral duty of this actor? Now, I'm not saying that moral duties are never good extensions, but oftentimes it's gauged in the language of, oh, but this is hypocrisy. They used to do this, but now they are doing this, and this is clearly, like, immoral, or something to that effect. This is a new piece of analysis. It could be well built. You could give lots of examples for why the Republican Party in the past did this and now they're doing this. So this is hypocrisy or whatever. Or maybe China or the US used to do this, but now they're doing this. The classic argument with the United States of America used to protect democracy, but now they are, propping up dictatorships, blah, blah. All that sort of stuff. This is a new piece of content. This argument can be internally very well structured. But unless you prove why this argument just weighs over everything that has come up in opening half, you will not get credit for this argument, and you just leave the judge confused as to what you said and what the point was of what you said, even if it is well built. So that's the first step of this. What are things that happen in opening often, and why do they mess up? Why aren't they always perfect? The first thing I've already identified is deadlocks. And this happens a lot, and this will happen in your debate career a lot, because quite simply, खुद से सोचो यार, openings have limited time. Openings oftentimes forget to weigh things. Openings oftentimes forget to respond to things. They need to get done with their content. They don't have lots of time to respond. उस तरह की चीजें बार बार होती रहती हैं. And oftentimes you will notice is there's some unresolved clash in the debate that both teams have just not addressed. They've said their points. It's largely going parallel. They might think that they're in their world they're winning because their harm is bigger or whatever, but they actually haven't done anything to resolve the clash. So what you do as closing, and you explicitly say this to the judge, you flag this. You say that there was a deadlock in opening. We are going to resolve this to XYZ. The next question is, how do you resolve deadlocks? Now, obviously, this is very contextual. I can't give you like examples for every single thing, but what I'd say is one of the key ways in which Hamza and I, for instance, do this, and what I've learned from Hamza is, you take opening opposition, or their team across you at their best. And this is something which openings often forget, which is they go on this like, this is our benefit. They go on like, this is our harm. And then the debate usually happens on what is the probability of the benefit materializing or the harm materializing. One key way of resolving deadlocks at closing is to say, look, we're going to accept that this harm materializes. We are then going to show to you why, even in the worst case scenario, i.e., their best case scenario, our worst case scenario, we still take it over them because our benefits are XYZ in so many ways better than theirs, or more certain than theirs. And there's ways of weighing that I can talk about later on, but you can do this. So the even if thing and the taking them at their best thing is a key tactic that is used in extensions. Now, technically, you're not saying anything new. I mean, you can come up with new rebuttals or responses over there. You're basically using the same clash that has happened, and you're basically then just explaining to the judge why your side is winning the clash. Now, notice, this is not entirely new, but this is extremely relevant information for the judge, because what the judge needs to decide is which piece of content shifted the debate for proposition or opposition. You are now giving them the content to make them believe that this is the way the debate needs to go. So that's the first thing. Oftentimes deadlocks happen. The second thing is, I've mentioned this earlier on as well, Analytical gaps happen all the time. Now, I would caution against a mistake that happens oftentimes in closing, and even happens in top level rooms where people are like, oh, they gave you two mechanisms to prove their premise and prove their case. Let us give you two more. That is not enough because they've given mechanisms. The judge already believes those mechanisms. What you have basically done is give them more mechanisms. So basically, you solidified their case more, but the case was solid already. What you need to do is prove why your mechanism is key to them or their case functioning. And that's where I think the mechanism stuff, and that's where the mechanism extension happens. You need to prove why this mechanism, the mechanism that you're giving, are crucial and are more important than the mechanisms that opening has given. They can either be either one more true. Those mechanisms can have more impact. They can be, like more probable, all of that sort of stuff, which I'm sure you guys know to some extent. And then that's where you prove that, look, our mechanism proves X, Y, Z. Hence we take this debate. So that's the third thing. The fourth thing is with regards to impacts and framing, and you can always do it, but I would always be cautious about this, in the sense that unfortunately we debate in a paradigm which is very Western dominated, and oftentimes motions only work in Western liberal democracies. So for instance, oftentimes you will enter debates about human rights or religious freedoms, or women's rights, sexual freedoms, all of that sort of stuff. um, Sex and sexuality motions, all those things happen. um, and you will always automatically think, yeah, वैसे this motion makes so much sense in the developing world. Maybe this motion screws the gay community in Pakistan, or this screws women in the developing world, and so on. And what you're going to be saying is true, but oftentimes hota ye hai कि um, it kind of becomes a wash, where the other side just comes up and says, well, look, this motion won't work in there anyways. Like, those governments won't pass this legislation, or the backlash that will happen is symmetric on either side. Even if you go with your route, it's not like they're the conditions of the gay community in Pakistan are going to become much better. So what you're doing is in essence not moving much. Now, this is a classic trap that teams fall into. So don't fall into the trap. Only like, obviously developing world extensions work, but there's a way of making them work, as opposed to just saying कि यहाँ पे सबसे बड़ा impact होता है, यहाँ पे सबसे ज़्यादा vulnerable stakeholder होते हैं, तो यही यहाँ पे emotion हो रहा होता है. You just need to realize and make sure कि your case isn't symmetric. That's also a classic thing that extensions fall for. So that's the last thing. I've already talked about rebuttals and all of this sort of stuff. So again, just use these 5 things: framing, argument, analysis, rebuttal, weighing, and you will find an extension in some form anyways. Now, worst case scenario, what happens if, God forbid, opening has taken everything and we have nothing? Now what you do is you excuse me, take what is called a strategic second. In debate tournaments, it is almost impossible for you to take the first every single round. You will not take the first every single round. In debate tournaments, the most important thing is actually not taking the first every single round. It is preventing yourself from taking the third or the fourth. Because if you take seconds, you will break. उस पे हो जाता है, like if you track, then you break. Um, and how do you take a second then? And this is where the strategy comes in again. That's where you basically say, अच्छा मेरी speech में ना अब मैं opening government को mention ही नहीं करूँगा. कोई जरूरत नहीं है उनकी बात करने की, उनके खिलाफ वे करने के लिए कोई टाइम ज़ाया करने की जरूरत नहीं है. What I'm going to do is basically just rebut the fuck out of the other benches across me, and basically prove कि उनका case बस गलत है, उनका case improbable है, it's untrue, whatever you need to do. That's the case that you need to tank, and that's what your team's focus will be. And in that sort of scenario, rebuttal extensions work fantastically. Um, and that's why I think rebuttal extensions are undervalued, because strategically they can be very useful in scenarios where you just think कि यार अब तो हम फंस गए हैं. The thing about rebuttal extensions though is you need to flag to the judge कि आपकी rebuttal नहीं है. It's a new rebuttal. And the second thing is कि the rebuttal is important. If opening government, for instance, has already given a rebuttal to OO, which has done significant damage to their case, and your rebuttal is adding basically कुछ भी नहीं हो रहा उससे, already वो argument out है debate के, then your rebuttal won't make sense. So what you need to do is take the strongest pieces of content that are coming from both benches and just weigh against them, rebut them, and take the strategic second. Is how I think about this. Um, that done, another key strategy with regards to winning cases, and this is with the weighing bit, because there are obviously 4 or 5 ways of weighing, and then those I'll explain now. The first one is likelihood. If you can prove that your case is more likely, that the benefit or the harm that you're talking about is more likely, then you can oftentimes take the debate. One way of doing this is it's like obviously you can make likelihoods ke ye hoega because actors incentives blah blah blah. Another way of doing it is the long term short term comparative, whereby if another team is arguing in the long run, you can oftentimes make the long run benefits contingent on short run benefits that you're arguing for, and say, look, the long run benefits only materialize if the short run happens, and it's really improbable that they're going to happen without our case. So make it contingent. That's one way of doing it. The second way of doing it is obviously impact size, by saying that the impact of our argument is bigger, it affects more people, it affects them more profoundly. So the depth of the impact, the breadth of the impact is another way. The third way is oftentimes you can identify a key vulnerable stakeholder, some actor that the motion presumes the government or the state or whatever, whichever actor in question has special duties to, and must protect at all costs, even if there are certain harms that are accrued. Vulnerability is a key thing, and the last thing is dependency, where you're basically making the comparison with your opening and saying their argument is dependent on your mechanism. So these are four ways of doing this: likelihood, impact size, vulnerability, and dependency. There are many more ways of doing it. I'm sure you'll find them before a novice thing. I think this is enough. So this is, I think, done with extensions. I'm happy to entertain any questions about, if I've left any questions unanswered. Um, if you guys have any questions about, the extension, how to make it, if anything's unclear, feel free to ask right now, because after this, I'm going to shift towards extension speeches and how to do them. Also, I just want to check if I'm audible right now. Hamza just put something in the chat.
Yeah, you are.
Okay, is there a question? If not, I'll move on.
Yeah, I have two questions. So, firstly, like I just find it a bit difficult to identify burdens. I saw a workshop where it was said that you should, like, it takes practice. You should try to identify what's the potential weak spot of your argument, and like that is the most important burden that you should try to fulfill. But especially since in extensions, it's important to have that understanding before you enter the debate. Would you have like any tips on how to be like better able to identify the burdens of the customers?
Okay. I'll just clarify though. The first thing is, the weak spot of your argument is not your burden. The weak spot of your argument is the weak spot of your argument. You need to fulfill that in any case. A burden is something like, let's just take a very simple motion, something to the effect of, this house would, yes, this is the most simple one. Like, this house would criminalize gambling, right? If that's the motion, what are the burdens on proposition and opposition? There can be multiple ones. One of the things that you will automatically think about in the debate is, gambling ought to be something that is like a right, or something that people should be allowed to do of their own volition, even if it causes them harm. That's one burden on proposition. Like, they can't just run the debate without proving something like that. Um, that's one burden. If you are opposition, then obviously the burden shift, and it's an opposite burden. So burdens are usually basically thought about, like, the way I think about them is what's the most fundamental clash in this debate. And most debates have clear clashes. KR, the famous, like, Boseo and everybody's Marxist revolution final that most people in Pakistan have watched. Like, the burdens over there are quite easy. Like, I think if you go through Bo's speech, it's basically him just saying कि मेरा burden ये नहीं है कि मैं ये prove करूं कि ये काम करेगा. And that's where you need to be very strategic in closings and openings, or generally in debating, where you realize that oftentimes the burden of your case is not proving that things will always go well. It is that things ought to be the way they are, regardless of consequences, something like that, something like that effect. Those are the kinds of things that burdens are. Now, I think that this is, I know that this is really vague and wishy-washy, but the reason why I'm doing this is, and not explaining this very well, is because burdens shift with every single debate, and you would basically realize it the more you debate. Like that's the only way that I've come to realize it. There's never been like a workshop that I've attended to, realize what the burden in a specific motion is. Um, but the burdens are basically just think about them as major clashes in the debate. What do we need to prove to basically win the debate? That's the question that a burden answers. um, Hopefully that answers you. If that was vague, I apologize.
नहीं नहीं आगे समझ समझे एक और सवाल ये था कि like you said कि developing countries के dynamics can also be an extension, but like how do you make like, but you said like not in all cases will that be effective enough. So like in which case, like what do you need to do if you want to use that as an extension?
Like, I think in terms of the developing countries thing, oftentimes motions in which developing country arguments work are motions like econ motions, because wahan pe na, basically the policy that you're applying is basically like going to be applied there anyways. और motions obviously that are specific to developing countries, उनमें तो बात ही पूरी debate में developing countries की ही होगी, like development motions होते हैं और aid motions होते हैं, इस तरह की चीजें होती हैं, उनमें तो होएगी बात. Gender motions में और sexuality motions में आपको थोड़ा सा, you'll have to be a bit more cautious. But how to sell your developing world extension is basically what you need to think about. Sorry. Okay, I'll just go for it. I'll assume somebody is unmuted accidentally. If you have a question though, feel free to ask in the chat. The way you sell your developing world extension is the first thing you need to do for any white judge that you face is you need to explain to them why this is not symmetric, why this is a unique harm that accrues because of whatever policy is being discussed in the debate, why this is a necessary thing. And basically if you do the first bit, now if you do the bit about this is not symmetric, this is more or less, and all of those sorts of things that you do to prove that your case isn't symmetric, it's not a wash. If you do that, your extension will fly. But you need to think about this carefully in prep कि ये हो भी सकता है कि नहीं. And that's basically the only way that you can be run like a developing world extension. That's going to be my advice. That's the one thing you need to focus on, because बाकी चीजें यार बहुत आराम से हो जाती हैं. Actors की vulnerability proof करना बहुत आराम से रहता है, वो developing world context में है. Low socio-economic status के लोगों की बात हो रही होगी, vulnerable minorities की बात हो सकती है, इस तरह की चीजें बात हो सकती हैं. वो vulnerable already हैं. हर एक को पता है कि developing world में developed world से ज़्यादा लोग रहते हैं, तो impact का size भी वहाँ पे है. So the major legwork in those kinds of arguments is actually not explaining your impacts. Like आपके impacts काफी ज़्यादा objectively clear होते हैं जज के लिए. होता ये है कि ये materialize कर रहा है कि नहीं कर रहा है, ये case में sense बनता है या नहीं बनता है, and that's the strategic call that you need to make. So whenever you're running that sort of extension, just be very कि symmetric तो नहीं हो रहा है. और अगर हो रहा है ना, तो already prep में decide कर लो कि हमने किस तरह इसको निकालना है symmetric bind से. How do we make it, something that's an actual argument as opposed to something that happens on both sides? That's going to be my advice for running developing world extensions. Because oftentimes like the biggest mistake teams make is it's like वो फिर 4 मिनट की contextualization होती है कि developing country में ये बुरा होता है, ये बुरा होता है, ये बुरा होता है, ये बुरा होता है. लेकिन explanation नहीं होती कि ये अच्छा किस तरह हो रहा है या फिर ये marginally बेहतर किस तरह रहेगा या harm किस तरह नहीं हो रहा है. वो असल legwork होता है argument का when you're running the developing world extension, as opposed to telling people कहानियाँ about characterization. So never get carried away with the characterization, especially when you're running a developing world thing. Unless it's very niche and the judge doesn't understand, then sure, go for it. But these are again calls that you need to make on the floor. Talk to your speaker, talk to the whip, and then decide. If that answers questions about extensions and how to come up with them, I am happy to move on.
I had another question, if that's okay.
Go for it. Go for it.
Right. So in terms of contextualization and closings, which is very weird that I've seen difference in circuits. So circuits might think that some circuits think that contextualization and so like opening is going to tell you these are our arguments, and they're not going to tell you why a thing is important, something, or why what relevance it has in the debate. And then the closings are just going to come and tell you that this is something art is important, what impact art has generally, and not actually maybe linking it to the motion, but sometimes they also do. What I've heard is that it becomes irrelevant and it doesn't contribute much to debate when closings do contextualize or recontextualize, or even if the openings analysis is based on the closings analysis. But there are circuits in which contextualization becomes important in closing. How do we does that differ like debate to debate, or is there like a fine line when you do think that contextualizations are important in closing? Because I don't think that they really are.
Look, some contextualizations and frames are irrelevant. That's just true. And that's also part of debating, by the way. Like, obviously, there are going to be, you're going to have some off days where you're going to characterize something and it's not going to be really relevant to the debate. But sometimes they aren't. So the example I'm going to use is there's this match on YouTube. If you had the time to watch it, watch it. I was a huge nerd when I was in school, so I was watching debate videos, obviously, because that's what teen boys do. Um, and what I was watching was it was I think 2015 Worlds or 2016 Worlds, and the top room had Harvard A with the Bosio team, and it had like the year's other finalists who were from Hart House, and then they had a team from I think there was like a New Zealand team or another good team. Oh, actually no, I think it was Harish and MDG, and these are the teams that were there. And then there was this team from UT Mara with Mifzal and uh, was it Jasmine? Yeah. So that's the classic debate where contextualization worked. So Mifzal and Jasmine were in CG. The motion was something to do with this house regrets the creation of feminist icons, people like Beyonce and Malala or so on. And opening half में सारी developed world debate थी. हर एक ने बात की थी कि how it stagnates the feminist movement or how it progresses the feminist movement, whatever new perspectives, blah blah blah. And Jasmine and Mizal just came and they won the round, which shocked many people because UT Mara is winning the top room, but they were actually pretty good as a team anyways. um, they won the round by arguing that in developing countries which don't have feminist movements that are very strong, the only way to get buy-in towards feminism and to get people, especially young girls, attracted towards feminism is through feminist icons who oftentimes need to be celebrities. So even if, and this is how they did the extension. So they were like, yes, what opening opposition is saying is true. Like feminist icons don't always represent feminism well. There might be personal hypocrisies behind the scenes, like Beyonce, for instance, with her factories in Bangladesh, um, or they might just not talk the right things. They might just confuse feminism, like J.K. Rowling, for instance, like saying transphobic stuff and all of that sort of stuff. Like they can definitely cause harm. The problem is that harm is still happens upscale. The first step for you to have a feminist movement that benefits the most vulnerable people is for you to get women and young girls interested in feminism to begin with. And that's where the developing world frame came in. And they were like, the only way to do that in a country where, for instance, feminist marches, etc., aren't allowed, where women are sexually and physically repressed, they can't go out, they don't have freedom of movement, where they can't organize, is for a young girl to be watching American Idol or watching their favorite pop star on TV, because that is the only thing that is allowed, and them portraying feminist messages. So characterization can be really powerful. That's what they were saying is not a new argument per se. Like the argument bit is just like minimal in that case. But what they've basically done is they've said, ओ जी आपने जो भी बातें की हैं वो अच्छी हैं गोरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में फिट है, ओ आपने जो भी बातें की हैं वो भी फिट हैं गोरे कॉन्टेक्स्ट में। हम आपका एक डेडलॉक चल रहा है, हम उस डेडलॉक को तोड़ देते हैं, ये लें टूट गया। सबसे ज़्यादा लोग अफेक्टेड भी डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज में होते हैं, सबसे ज़्यादा औरतों के साथ ज़्यादतियाँ भी डेवलपिंग कंट्रीज में होती हैं, हम ये डिबेट जीत रहे हैं। एंड दैट्स हाउ दे वांट टू डिबेट। सो व्हाट I'm going to say is सर्किट्स को ना सोचा करो यार, कभी भी डिबेट करते हुए ना ये ना सोचा करो कि यार इस सर्किट में ये रिक्वायरमेंट है, इस सर्किट में ये रिक्वायरमेंट है। ये पाकिस्तानी सर्किट का ना क्लासिक मसला है कि अच्छा अभी पाकिस्तानी सर्किट में तो ये चलता है लेकिन बाहर के सर्किट में ये चलता है, और फिर आप ना पूरी जिंदगी डिबेटिंग में बस ये करते रहते हो कि पाकिस्तान सर्किट में मैंने ये कहना है और बाकी बाहर वाली सर्किट में ये कहना है और उसके बाद आपकी डिबेटिंग कुछ भी नहीं रहती. Like I have personal experience of this where I used to go to international tournaments and debate and come back and change my style to debate for the Pakistani circuit. And after the first year, I just found that to be a useless thing. If Pakistani judges, for instance, and this happens a lot, don't give credit to arguments that are made well, then just accept the fact that they or like any judge, for instance, like even if it's like an Iona judge judging you at Docksbridge or something, if they don't give credit to a good argument, then they're just not a good judge. Like you can't do anything to change that. Debating का style हमेशा से सही रहता है. Characterization and framing are crucial because there's one thing in an argument which is proving an argument is true. The other thing is, and the more important thing is usually proving that the argument is relevant and important in the context of debate. You can't do that without characterization or framing. So if somebody says कि characterization नहीं करनी चाहिए, फिर वो पता नहीं फिर वो debating कर लें, मतलब वो debating फिर नहीं हो सकती. आप literally नहीं कर सकते. How do you resolve clashes then? Like characterization is key in every context, in every debating context, regardless of whatever some judges will tell you. Like the top judges will always tell you कि obviously useful होता है. Obviously अब इसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि debate में सिर्फ characterization करनी है. लेकिन हाँ, it's useful. Any other questions?
So sorry, just to follow up on that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Like so contextualization, if it is in terms of clarification, would be more useful at closings.
I don't get what you mean. Like sometimes you can do clarification and say the debate is not about what these guys are talking about, or you can clarify certain things like their rebuttal misses the point, and that's what the clarification you need to make. Uh, Contextualization doesn't always need to be in terms of clarification. Contextualization is oftentimes separate. Obviously, it can be in terms of clarification. It's not always necessary. It can be, it can't be, but there's no one way to go about it. Like there's no one size fits all. कि यही होगी characterization. There's multiple ways of doing it, and you assess the situation और उसके मुताबिक क्या होता है. If a debate requires a clarification, if opposition has completely misidentified your burden, if opposition is asking you to do something that you humanly possibly can't defend or can't do, which happens in debates, like कभी कभार वो बहुत ही गंदा burden डालते हैं, तब आप clarify करते हैं कि हमारा burden ये है, ये नहीं है, and then you can just move on. But like it's not always necessary.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
No problem. If there aren't any other, I'll just move to how to.
I have a question.
Yeah, go.
So like I had two questions, but so something that Noor already talked about as well. So like I've seen how a lot of like things when you talk about Pakistani examples, a lot of that is like something that most of the judges or people aren't exactly familiar with. So at that point, how do you use that to your advantage and make sure that like you sort of explain these examples to these people and like sort of maybe like have that kind of a unique extension on your part, or because like most of the times because it's not something that an average informed voter apparently knows, so like a lot of time that no, that example or that context could be like discredited as well by the judge. So like something that I've like seen as well, like at the quarters as well, where I was probably told that the example was probably too specific and didn't exactly like wasn't exactly seen that it could be applied anywhere else as well. So like how do you actually deal with that?
Okay, I'll say this. I think you can use your background to your advantage. So oftentimes, in motions about, if there's a terrorism motion going on, and the Pakistani context, you can make lots of examples and they will make sense. So in those kinds of motions, go for it. Because in those kinds of motions, you will usually like the judge will usually also know if they're basically thoda bahut smart कि इधर ये sense बनाती है. But what I will say is I will caution you against using Pakistani examples all the time. That's simply because I mean, in the ideal world, we would want all judges to know everything about every country, right? Like, for instance, if you were at Shajibna or if you were at the Lums Ivy and somebody was giving examples of like, how the local elections in Guatemala work, you wouldn't expect a Pakistani judge to understand anything that's going on in debate because honestly, the Pakistani judge has no idea. Unfortunately, we live in a world where people don't have access to perfect information. They or debaters around the world oftentimes get their information from Western media sources like the CNN or Al Jazeera ho gaya, ya phir is tarah kuch ho gaya. And that those are the kinds of things that they read. So they're not going to have access to these examples all the time. So what I would say is use them strategically in motions where you need to use them. But in motions where they're not absolutely necessary, I would just say use examples that are a bit more mainstream, because debate at the end is also like, an exercise in persuasion, and your examples won't always fly. Vani and I encountered this problem at Words where we were just like, why aren't our cases working? These were the exact same cases we were working in the local circuit, like, 6 months ago. We were taking firsts. What's happening over here? Why are we taking fourths? And then we realized कि यार इनको शायद समझ ही नहीं आ रही. And then the strategy was, one, if you're using a Pakistani example, just explain it really, really well. You can't just name drop and say कि अच्छा ये हुआ था, and expect those people to understand. If you're using the Pakistani example in front of a judge who wouldn't know, explain it really well, go through the example, and make the analogies that you want to make, or make the point that you want to make clearly. So that's the first thing we did. And the second thing we did was we just tried to use less of them, honestly. Um, and that's unfortunate, but that's also real. Like, यहाँ पे बाल्कन डिबेटर्स भी फॉर इंस्टेंस अपने मुल्कों के एग्जांपल्स नहीं दे सकते थे ज़्यादा, unless उनके मुल्क के बारे में मोशन हो. It's just like, unfortunate, but steer away from it. I just say like कि पाकिस्तानी एग्जांपल्स जितनी कम इस्तेमाल कर सकते हो कर लो. वे कई मोशंस में ऑब्वियसली चलेंगी, लेकिन यूजुअली मेन स्ट्रीम एग्जांपल्स चल जाती हैं. Did you have a
That's
second question?
So that's more like that's like kind of a lame question, but also like a very sad one as well. So like usually we have seen that like whenever we've had like EPL teams as our opening, so like also mainly like the teams with like a huge rep as well. So like a team like LSU or Harvard, etc. So like even if you like tweak in like maybe unique reasons or like unique examples as well, or so like maybe the base argument is same of the opening and your base argument is same as well, and like they have literally used like all of those arguments that you had in mind in the prep as well, but like you had sort of different analysis to those arguments, and even if you try to like use that analysis as well in debates, they don't exactly work. So like even if you fill in those loopholes, they don't work either. Even if you try to like come up with new rebuttals, they don't exactly work either. So like in your other closing is not going to engage with you either, because they're always going to call you derivative. So like how do you exactly deal with that? Because then you're like automatically fourth in that much.
Look, I think पहले तो ये है कि I suspect what's happening is, one, obviously, rep matters, and unfortunately I can't do anything about it. Like, but it's a thing that I can't change as a judge, or tell you कि आपकी extension अगर इस तरह होगी तो rep उसको affect नहीं करेगी. Rep ने उसको symmetrically affect करना है हर जगह. Another note for extension speakers on how to think about symmetries, but rep नहीं करना है effect, उसके बारे में आप कुछ नहीं कर सकते. What you can't do is just get bogged down with कि अब हम rep क्यों ऐसे हार रहे हैं. I think the most useful thing is also, like, this is hurtful क्योंकि आप फिर end पे काफी ऐसी चीजें करते हो जो आपको नहीं करनी चाहिए होती हैं. लेकिन I still think that the most useful way to think about this is, शायद कहीं पे मैं derivative sound कर रहा हूँ या कर रही हूँ, और शायद कुछ हो रहा हो जो मैं सही नहीं कर रही, और उसकी वजह से फिर कोई मसला आ रहा है. Because I think that's the only productive way of doing it, because दूसरे का तो कोई solution ही नहीं है, पहले वाले का कोई solution निकल आ सकता है और उसकी वजह से आप बेहतर हो सकते हैं. So there are a couple of strategies doing this. One, if you fear that other teams are going to call your extension derivative, do not use the language used by opening government or opening opposition, जो भी आपकी opening team है. This is one of the strategic things, like judges will always fall for this. If you use the same language now, if you gouge your arguments in the same language, the same rhetoric, similar examples, nobody will buy your argument at face value. They will just say that this is derivative. So be very clear about using different examples. But the second thing is, and teams, I don't know why they shy away from this, don't be very explicit about how you're different. Like, if you explain that you are different and the other team is just simply not listening to why you are different, then that's just going to be on them. A good judge or a semi-decent judge will just be like, आपने तो उनको respond नहीं किया, आप नहीं जीत सकते, at least a debate. I think the third thing is, and I suspect this is also happening a lot, which also happens to me all the time, is you are giving new mechanisms. They are genuinely new, but it is incredibly unclear what they're adding. Like, हार्वर्ड वगैरह ने शायद कोई मैकेनिज्म डाल दी हो, दो तीन, ठीक है, और वो चल गई हो, आपके पास दो तीन और हो. लेकिन अनलेस आप प्रूव करते हो कि आपकी मैकेनिज्म उनसे बहुत बेहतर है, ठीक है, आपकी मैकेनिज्म नहीं होगी, लेकिन आप बेसिकली ना उनकी ही आर्गुमेंट प्रूव कर रहे हो with nothing much in between. It's not key to their case, and that's why some teams will, even if your arguments are new, they will just call it derivative and say कि यार ये तो same चीज है. So शायद वो रहो, लेकिन अगर रैप की बात है तो generally I'm just like it's unfortunate, I'm sorry for you, but like उसके बारे में कुछ नहीं किया जा सकता, बाकी चीज़ों के बारे में कुछ किया जा सकता है, और उसमें स्ट्रेटेजिक होना पड़ता है, आपको बहुत ही ज़्यादा मीसना होना पड़ता है और कहना पड़ता है कि भाई ये हमारी लैंग्वेज है, इस तरह हम नए हैं, ये इस तरह की बातें काम नहीं करती हैं इस डिबेट में. Hopefully that's clear. If it is,
Yeah,
I'll go on
thank
to
you.
extension speeches. Okay, very quickly, extension speeches. I had a couple of questions here as well. जहाँ पे लोग पूछ रहे थे कि how do you structure them, how do you manage time, and those things. First things first. Do not spend lots of time rebutting in extension speeches. That is the worst thing you can do to yourself and your partner who has the time to rebut, but will now just be, whipping nothing. Your duty as extension, very simply, is to put down a case so that your second speaker can whip it and win you the debate. इसका मतलब क्या है? इसका मतलब ये है, और ये मैक्सिमम रूल ऑफ थंब रख लें अपने लिए, मतलब बिगिनर्स के लिए तो बहुत ही अच्छा है. बाद में स्ट्रेटेजिक कॉल्स बनानी होगी बना लें. 2 रिबटल देने हैं बस. टॉप ऑफ द स्पीच you can be like one clarification, one rebuttal, one observation, whatever. 2 things that are extraneous that you are going to rebut. That is it. Nothing more than that. If you spend more than 1.5 minutes on this, you are screwed, because what you are trying to do in this round, and member speeches are oftentimes the most difficult speeches in the round, is you are trying to tackle 2 other teams above you, and you are trying to give your own case, which is next to impossible, positively. So what do you do then? After you do this two extraneous pieces of rebuttal, sometimes it will be one, sometimes you will also like not need to rebut at all, because your case will have the rebuttals inbuilt in it. You will not need to do like extraneous rebuttal. um After you do that, you will move on to your argument. Like, just rule of thumb, give your argument at least 5 minutes. 5 minutes for extension is has got to be the rule. If you don't, then you will just miss out on content, and in extension every little word will matter. Like, कोई नया word आ गया, कोई भी नई piece of analysis आ गई, could change the flow of the debate. If there's a rebuttal जो आपको बहुत खारिश हो रही है और आपको देना है, अपने पार्टनर से बात करें और उनसे कहें कि ये दे दे, और उससे हो जाएगा काम. मेरे से ये गलती बहुत दफा हुई है. Don't repeat this mistake. That's the first thing. There is no set structure I want you guys to follow. Like, I have no set structure of my own. The structure, all like my decision always is that the structure will follow how the debate is going, and I will then decide कि सबसे ज़रूरी चीज़ क्या है, सबसे कम ज़रूरी चीज़ क्या है, and basically my partner will follow suit. Now, what should ideally like your structure basically be like? The first thing is, um, you do your rebuttals, whatever you do, just do it. The second thing is, has opening half entered into a deadlock? वो वाला सवाल होएगा. And you will also notice कि इसमें ना time spend करना इतना ज़्यादा नहीं चाहिए होता. आपको जज को बस ये explain करना होता है कि ओजी ने आपको ये benefit दिया है, ओ ने आपको ये harm दिया है, इन्होंने ये नहीं बताया कि harm बड़ा है या benefit बड़ा है, अभी बहुत uncertain है ये, और इस uncertainty की वजह से ये case deadlock में है. इसमें literally आपको 10 सेकंड या 15 सेकंड लगेंगे, और उसके बाद आप दे देंगे ये है 5 मैकेनिज्म ठक जल्दी से दे दिए 30 सेकंड के अंदर, या फिर पता नहीं आपको मिनट भी लग गया तो लग गया. आपने 5 लिटरली 5 रीजन दे दिए, 4 रीजन दे दिए, जितने भी दे दिए. आपने कहा दिस इज हाउ वी रिजॉल्व द डेडलॉक. What you have done is efficiently, literally efficiently, what you have done is you have taken out openings in like one minute, like 2 minutes, whatever. Like 4 मिनट तक आपकी जो स्पीच है रिबटल्स और उसके समेत वो निकल गए हैं. ठीक है. Then you can also build your case and be like, this is our new argument, or this is our new frame. Even if you don't buy this deadlock stuff, these are reasons for why. So that's what your extension should ideally look like. Start with the most important thing. Start with the thing that wins you the debate, and then work through. कभी कभार ये होगा कि अब बहुत ज्यादा कंटेंट होगा और कुछ रह जाएगा, कोई मसला नहीं है, रह जाए तो रह जाए. अगर आपकी लीस्ट फेवरेट आर्गुमेंट और लीस्ट इंपैक्टफुल आर्गुमेंट रह गई है डिबेट में तो कोई मसला नहीं है, उससे कोई फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा राउंड पे. I like the way that you make this decision is also by looking at, if I had said this, would this have mattered? And in most likelihood, like, नहीं नहीं उससे कुछ होना था. um and that's the decision that you make. Oftentimes what speakers do is they just start speaking very fastly and quickly, sorry, and then they just rush through their points, don't make lots of sense, and then they're like, अच्छा मैंने ये 5 बातें तो कर दी थी, वो 5 बातें किसी को समझ नहीं आई. So it's best to take your time with the more important things. Even if the less important things are, you don't have time for them, fine, You don't have time for them. Make your peace with it. Move on. So that's the second thing I'll say. The third question that we had was with regards to what do whips do if extension has messed up? The answer to that is not a lot, but a lot of things that are unethical in debates are what I would advise you to do. Um, in WIP, if extension has missed certain things, obviously WIP can't bring in new positive material, but what WIP can always do is frame and like give new rebuttals and give new frames. WIPs are allowed to do that. Now, one of the ways when I was whipping for Vani, the things that I used to do, and even Hamza like currently does right now, is you frame a positive point as a rebuttal. You basically say उन्होंने ये बात की थी, ठीक है, ये बात इस बात से क्लैश करती है, ये रिबटल है, आप इसको एक्सेप्ट कर लें. That's one way for you to get some contribution in at whip. Some judges will buy it, some judges won't. Like most judges at the end just buy it because it's like new framing anyway. So whip if your speaker has missed something, new framing. Um, if your speaker has not, obviously like another thing is just rebuttal. Like if for instance like there was a world's round where obviously this attempt failed, but Vani messed up extension, कभी कभार हो जाता है, हो गया था. um, अब उस पॉइंट पे एज विप आई एम आल्सो डूइंग द सेम थिंग, राइट? लाइक जो मैंने तुम लोगों को पहले बताया, अगर आपको पता चल गया कि आप राउंड में फर्स्ट तो कहीं से भी नहीं आ रहे, तो आपको ये होना चाहिए कि मैं फोर्थ ना हूँ, और उस फोर्थ ना आने के लिए ना आपको फिर बेसिकली सिर्फ रिबटल हैवी होना पड़ता है. और आप फिर कहते हो कि अच्छा ठीक है, फिर मैं सीओ को निकालूंगा, इसको निकालूंगा, उसको निकालूंगा. और वे पे भी आप स्ट्रेटेजिक कॉल्स बनाते हो कि अच्छा मैंने अब किस किस टीम की बात करनी है, कितनी ज्यादा बात करनी है, कितना कम टाइम देना है, वगैरह वगैरह. So if extensions messed up, that's what you do at whip. Try to bring in new material as framing, and also just like strategically use your time to take out the weakest teams so that you ensure that you at the very least are not a fourth. Zero नहीं मिलना चाहिए debate के अंदर. बाकी जो मर्जी मिलता है उसको bonus की तरह लेके आगे चले जाओ. That's with regards to the whip thing. Another thing with your speeches, oftentimes take PO, like always take POIs from opening. Like ask for POIs from opening. Some judges are very anal about this. They will go like, you didn't give, or like whenever the debate is closed, they'll be like, oh, आपने opening से POI नहीं लिया, आपने कोई chance नहीं दिया engage करने का, आपके पास बहुत chance है engage करने के लिए. Like, so ideally, if your extension, take a POI from opening. But the second thing I would say is just like a strategic thing that I do oftentimes is पहला POI ले लो. होता है कभी कभार like what happens is like 1 minute passes and suddenly they're like point. Now either what they're doing is, one, they're asking for a clarification, which is very good. If they're asking for a clarification in your case and something is not clear, take the opportunity to clarify it for them, and the judge, chances are if they didn't understand it, the judge didn't, take the clarification, be done with it. But the second thing is, they will oftentimes come up with the first rebuttal that they think of. And the first rebuttal that they think of isn't the most useful rebuttal for their case, because you obviously have a lot more to say about their case in the ensuing minutes. So take the first thing, do your engagement with, take the like meaningless POI, whatever they're going to give you, and be done with your engagement. So that's another strategic thing that I do. It. I don't do like, oftentimes I've seen speakers that they like after the 5th minute. That's the worst time to take a POI after the 5th minute. You're rushing through your content. You need to do weighing. You either need to add in more mechanisms, do more analysis, or add in your impact. That's the worst time to do it. Like, why would you want to take a POI that distracts you from your speech? Because oftentimes, like कई टीमें usually they use POIs not for rebuttals or not for clarification, but explicitly just to distract you so that they can waste your time and you don't get the time to make your point. So that's when the distraction hits you the worst. The safest point in your speech to take a POI is the first minute. If that's clear, that's the last thing I want to talk about your speeches is always integrate rebuttal. And this is again where notes come in handy, where debates में ना usually guys like 3 से ज़्यादा clash नहीं होते. If you are going extension, उन 3 clashes पे speech structure कर दो. Take different pens or whatever, or make different arrows, use different sides of paper, whatever suits you best. ठीक है? Say OG ने ये mechanism दिया था, O का response ये था, हमारा response ये है. ठीक है? What you basically done is positive response आ गया, उनका response tag कर दिया, ये rebuttal भी हो गया integrate करके. What the benefit of this is, you have saved yourself time. You don't need to use the scattergun approach and be like, अब इसको अलग अलग से rebut करूंगा और फिर अलग अलग से वापस उस case पे आऊंगा. वो वाली चीज नहीं करनी होती है. सिंपली आपने इंटीग्रेट करना, जितना ज्यादा इंटीग्रेट करोगे उतना ज्यादा फायदा है. इंटीग्रेट करना शुरू में मुझे काफी मुश्किल लगा था, शायद आप लोगों को भी लगे, बट you get better at it with practice. Just whenever you're writing your extension, be very active when you're writing your extension. Oftentimes people what they do is कि वो बस अपना केस लिख देते हैं, ये मेरे 3 पॉइंट हैं और बस. That's not how you do extension. When you're writing your speech, consider and very carefully place where you want to say what, because that will make a world of a difference. It will save you a lot of time, and in extension speeches, oftentimes what you need is time, because either you need to go through a lot of points or you want to explain something in a lot of detail. Um, yeah, so that's my thing about extension speeches and how you should do them. The last thing I would note, which doesn't really fall very neatly into what is an extension and what is an extension speech, is this question about knifing. This oftentimes comes up in extension where you need to make the decision. If your opening has gone rogue, like actual bad shit crazy, what do you do? Some teams will go the route of saying, look, they did go rogue. And in some cases, it will be merited for you to say, look, they went rogue. This is not the motion. They've either spilled the motion or they're doing a debate that doesn't exist on this planet, something to that effect. If they're doing that, then I'd say you can obviously go and say, look, this is what the debate is about, and this is what we're going to do. Apart from like, always remember in closing, obviously you can't give a new policy or something, so your wiggle room is very limited. Um, but the second thing I would say is, the best thing that you can do for yourself, in terms of if you find yourself in a position where you have to knife someone, is use the even if strategy, where you're like, okay, OG had a fantastic case, which they didn't. They went rogue, but you say, okay, OG had this fantastic case. O's contention was this is not the debate, and they gave like an alternative case, alternative metrics, an alternative debate. What we are going to do is engage in the even if scenario and tell you why, even on O's grounds, we are going to beat them. This is one way of you for you to do the same debate, not make it seem to the judge that you are explicitly knifing someone. And also notice that you've done the thing where I told you about extension, right? Where you've resolved some deadlock in the opening, where you said, best case scenario, O's harms materialize. OG was not accepting that they materialized because they were on a different debate. Uh, and this is where we put in our extension and we win the debate. So if you find yourself in the knifing circumstance, the ideal thing for you to do is for you to actually just be in an even if scenario. If you can't possibly do that, you find yourself in a position where the even if just doesn't work, then obviously then your hands are tied. There's no such thing as a fourth for knifing, by the way. Like if you guys think of that, us tarah se kuch nahi hota hai. Yeah, so in terms of knifing, that's the thing. That's it for the speeches. If you have more questions, feel free to ask.
Hi, Taha. I had a few questions.
Go ahead.
Could you repeat the point of the weighing as a type of extension?
Weighing,
Because what a
yes,
preliminary felt was that you are at best already the arguments are on the floor.
yeah.
So won't your contribution to the debate in a weighing type of extension be very minimal?
Okay, so let me just posit it this way, right? Let's say there's a debate about, I mean, this is a very bad example, but also like explains the point really well. There's a debate about, this house believes that the sun will rise in the east or something to that effect, like about China rising or something. And opening makes like some really fancy argument, China is getting better or this or that, whatever, something to that effect. The key part of any argument in a BP debate is never how true it is. Just recognize this, yaar. You guys are all debaters. Presumably, like, अब कई लोग stupid कभी कभार हो जाते हैं, वो तो होता है, हर एक के साथ होता है. लेकिन यूजुअली हर कमरे में ना सारे लोग stupid नहीं होंगे. हर किसी की बात में कोई ना कोई sense होएगी. They are going to be making some point, and there is going to be some relative truth to each point. Each point is going to be true to some degree. Now, yes, one way of winning the debate is to, debate about the relative truths of the points and be like, oh, मैंने आपका point rebut कर दिया है. But sometimes you just can't completely rebut a point. Sometimes all you can do is mitigate a point and just the point still exists, the harm still exists. The most efficient and clean way of winning debates is to tell the judge why your point is the most important point. Also note, like, in terms of efficiency, you have 7 minutes. the speakers above you in openings have had 14 minutes each, so 28 minutes of argumentation have happened. There is no way in hell you are dealing with 28 minutes of argumentation and also bringing in your own arguments in 7 minutes. That's why in BP debating the question isn't कि किस टीम ने ज्यादा arguments दिए हैं या किस टीम की argument ज्यादा सच थी, है जो भी obviously सच वाली बात और थोड़ी सी relevant होती है, लेकिन सबसे ज्यादा बड़ी बात होती है कि किसकी बात सबसे ज्यादा जरूरी थी, what was the most important contribution in the debate, what's the thing that turned around. If somebody has explained their argument and have said this harm is true without really explaining why that harm is relevant, then you are basically making the case for them. They have just done half the job. This is just like an incomplete argument with a mechanism. There is no difference. This is just like arbitrarily हमने decide किया हुआ कि mechanism different होता है और ये different होता है. But अगर किसी ने mechanism नहीं दिया तो उन्होंने क्या किया? उन्होंने अपनी premise prove नहीं की. अगर किसी ने weighing नहीं की तो उन्होंने क्या किया? उन्होंने ये नहीं बताया कि argument जरूरी क्यों है. Or debates always happen on this, like if you've seen the MDG lecture, it's like a plane, it's like a graph. Like on one side you have how true your argument is, and on one side you have how important your argument is. And the best argument will not only just be true, it's also going to be extremely important. Okay? You've got to have a mix of both. Otherwise, the argument is not relevant. It's not going to win you the debate. The same thing that happened with the moral diplomacy stuff, like that I already told you, but like the stuff about hypocrisy being exposed in certain countries or actors. Like the argument can be true, the judge can give fuck all. Like उसको क्या फर्क पड़ रहा है इस argument से, उसको नहीं पता. अब I will still caution, like weighing isn't always the most optimal way, because कभी कभार ये होता है कि कभी कभार impacts बहुत ही ज़्यादा obvious होते हैं. Like if you start weighing death in a round, then that is obviously a bad decision. The weighing of the thing has already been done. Like हर एक को intuitively पता है कि ये बात बुरी क्यों है, इसका impact क्या होगा. But if you have other impacts that are going to be derived from this, or if you have like the 5 years of weighing that haven't been done, then you are legitimately taking it over opening. Opening hasn't explained the argument well enough. They haven't done the thing that was winning them the debate. They have just laid the foundations for you to take it for them. Just like they would if they didn't build an argument well, even though it was the correct argument to run in a debate.
Okay, so is weighing something like if opening gave an impact A, so like the opening government gave an impact like a benefit A, and opening opposition gave a harm B. So as a weighing extension, you can tell why the harm B is very less.
So
Could
yes,
that
that's
be
one
like
way
a
of doing it. One way of doing it is saying कि उनका harm बहुत mitigate हो गया है. It's less in comparison. The numbers game वगैरह. But that's why I was also saying the this thing I told you about. कि even if we take them at their best, that is technically you weighing. Principal
okay?
arguments oftentimes have internal weighing in them. So when you're like, this is the argument, the consequences don't matter. When you're saying the consequences don't matter, there's a reason for why they don't matter, and that is weighing. So any new principle argument that you bring in any debate is also technically just weighing. You are just giving a principle and saying, this is how I'm going to weigh this round. Um, so weighing is extremely crucial. It can be done through a plethora of ways. One is the way that you outline. The other one is, weigh impact size, vulnerability, dependency. You can also extend the impact. I also want to clarify this. All of these 5 things that I mentioned are not just completely separate categories. Oftentimes they will work in tandem with each other. So for instance, if there's a debate about some housing crisis, and um, and opening has mentioned like some people will lose homes because of this sort of economic crisis that will come up, and you go like, actually the area in which the homes will be lost the most is this area already has these sorts of circumstances. What you're doing is, one, you've changed the frame. Two, you've added depth of impact by positing like there's a more vulnerable actor or something. You've also added more analysis over there, and three, you weighed. So these things often go in tandem with each other. Don't think about these things as always separate categories. It's best to think of them as symbiotic things that just go along with each other, and one is often complete without the other. Um, so yeah, that's what I'd say. So what you basically, अगर तुम्हारा worst case scenario भी materialize कर जाता है ना, कि judge कहता है कि यार ये तो तुमने सिर्फ weighing किया, ये significant contribution नहीं है. उस weighing का फायदा पता है क्या? उस weighing का फायदा simple ये है कि आपका 1 मिनट लगा है उस weighing में, या चलो मतलब 2 मिनट लग गए उस weighing में, ठीक है? You still have like 4 other minutes or 3 other minutes for other parts of your argumentation. In extension, by the way, and this is also something I like to clarify, it's best not to just rely on one argument. Diversify as much as possible. That's what these different kinds of extensions allow you to do. It's like even if one thing fails, I have a fail safe. I can rely on that to do this. Like always be strategic in the call that you're making. If you just rely on weighing, then obviously कुछ भी हो सकता है. Judge शायद वो weighing माने ना, और आप screw हो जाओ. So my advice is never to just be like सिर्फ weighing करो. It's always be like जितना भी ज़्यादा कर सकते हो कर लो.
Okay, I had another question.
Yeah.
So for example, if I prep, suppose argument A, B, and C, and let's say only A and B, and a lot of the clashes in the opening are not something which I identified in the prep. So I have like two options. Either I believe in myself that what I have prepped could be like the most important contribution, or I try to find the loopholes and try to now run a rebuttal extension, or like impact the arguments of the opening same side opening better. So which do you think could be the way to go?
Yeah, I can't give you a one size fits all again because this is going to be contextual on debate. It could be the case that you made an error in prep and you've misidentified the burdens in the round and the clashes in the round. That is possible. हो सकता है. अगर हो जाए तो I would, my suggestion is अगर इस तरह की कोई situation rise हुए, unless it is completely obvious to you that both of these teams have basically just messed up the round, they're not going for the right clash, or they're going for the right clashes, but you have a more important clash that you've thought of, and you'd like to talk about that. Um, if that sort of scenario comes in, then go for it, dude. Like, um, cut to the chase. कह दो जज को कि ये क्लैश नहीं है, ये क्लैश इस ऑब्वियसली सिर्फ ये नहीं कहना कि क्लैश नहीं है, एक्सप्लेन भी करना है कि असल क्लैश क्या है, क्यों वो क्लैश है, and then talk about your argumentation. If you are really unsure at that point, I would not say कि just give up what you thought of in prep and just go for this. I would again go back to diversifying, which is do an even if or something very quickly about the clash, because obviously you don't have enough time to, you wouldn't have had enough time to think about this specific clash if you didn't anticipate it in prep. um, and try to do your best to resolve the clash, add in new material or add in new rebuttals, and then be like, हाँ ठीक है मेरे पास at least ये दूसरा fail safe भी है. It's just about adding as many fail safes as possible. So even if you're caught out, let's say like closing आपका member आता है कहते हैं कि यार इसका clash तो बिल्कुल ही obviously बस फालतू है, इस debate में है नहीं. Your whip can obviously disagree and give reasons for why it still exists. But then your whip can also be like slightly strategic and be like, अच्छा ठीक है ये clash नहीं है तो मैं आपके clash पे आपको हरा देता हूँ. और या फिर मैं पुराने क्लैश पे आपको हराता हूँ क्योंकि मेरे मेंबर ने एटलीस्ट ये बातें की तो थी ना. आई हैव दिस टू वर्क विद. सो व्हाट योर रोल इज, give your whip as much things as possible to work with. If one thing fails, they have something else to fall back to.
Right. I had a third question as well. So if others don't have, I can go ahead with that.
Go for it. I'm answering all questions anyways.
Okay. So like you said that it's very important to communicate with the partner, but assuming that the online debating is like likely to stay for at least the next 6 months or probably even like 8 this year. So in the worst case that this extends to an year, we like have very little chances to connect with our partner. So one of the strategies that we both decided was that in my member speech, instead of like going for rebuttal, what I'll do is I'll weigh over our opening half in my own speech, and you go all out with the rebuttals. So do you think that's like a fair thing to do, or like could we reach another alternative, like given the pandemic?
Yeah, I think if communication is a problem, like obviously everybody faces it. I think Hamza and I are extremely lucky that we live close to each other, and we are allowed because of the rules to speak together. So we oftentimes are speaking from the same place and we can communicate. Um, when I was back in Lums, though, we had this situation where Essen, who's now in the call, he was in Karachi, and my other partner wasn't obviously in my house, so we had to go through Australs, basically trying to communicate online. I would just be like, एक तो ये होता है कि constantly text each other, But also another strategy could be obviously you call for prep or whatever, but also just maintain a call on the side. वैसे ही कि अगर किसी को बात करनी हो तो वो जल्दी से वो बात कर दे. Because it's not optimal for you to be like I'll be over opening and you do the rebuttals, because like what if they have a rebuttal that's shit, or what if your weighing has some errors in it. There's lots of things that you need to figure out as a team. Uh, and strategic calls that you're going to make are going to be made obviously us tarah se hi. I would also say, by the way, that if you're thinking of whip as in a role where they just have to rebut and you have to weigh, then that's just incorrect. Like I would just point out, like that's incorrect. सबसे बड़ा रोल ही whip का debate के अंदर weighing होता है. Beyond their like the expectation that a whip has to rebut, the whip basically has the time. Like you don't have the time to always weigh everything. You will not have the time to do this. You will have the time. You will barely have the time to build your positive argument if you're lucky. um, what the whip needs to do is explain to the judge कि ये हमारी argument थी, and basically the most ideal whip which Hamza also does is कि you go to the judge and say, like, I'll discuss OG first, I'll discuss O second, I'll discuss CG like third or whatever, and I'll just weigh against every single team in the round and tell you why we take it over each. Basically, the whip is giving a biased oral adjudication. It's like a reply speech in schools, except this also has rebuttals allowed in it. A whip speech is like an oral adjudication, and that's how it should go. So weighing is extremely crucial in whip. Don't make your whip not weigh. इससे बेसिकली एक और भी तो मसला है, बहुत ही सिंपल सा मसला है कि आपके स्पीक्स ठुक जाएंगे. मतलब कोई भी गोरा जज आपको स्पीक्स नहीं देगा अगर आपका वेब पे नहीं करा.
Okay, got it. Yeah, I really like the idea of keeping the call on side. I think that would help us.
Any other questions from anybody?
I had a question, but it's not really related to extensions. But just what you said regarding web speeches, and like I've usually had this sort of dilemma whenever I'm writing my web speeches, whether I should go clash wise and why we win the most important clashes in web speeches, or go team wise. And even though I have this whole heuristic that when the debate is muddled, you go team wise, and when it's clear, you go sort of clash wise. But is there like some other advice?
I think what you're doing is fine. Like, there's no one way of doing it, and the best whip speakers mix it up. They can do clash and they can do team wise. I would just say, कि, so for personally for me, the more, like, obviously the clash thing is beneficial because what it does is it saves you time. But what the benefit of on the converse for the team by team weighing thing is it makes things incredibly clear. So you might be repeating some points here and there, but what you're doing is basically telling the judge कि यार इनसे तो हमने ऊपर ले लिया है. Also, I think the benefit of the team by team thing for me at least was whips have to be strategic. Like again, you have limited time. You can't just discuss every single team in depth. So you can basically go for, like, the question that Hamza and I usually ask ourselves is which team is the one that's closest to us? किनका chance है debate में? किनके साथ अभी पंगा हो रहा है? कहाँ पे फंसी हुई है debate? उनको सबसे ज़्यादा time दे दो, उनको हरा दो. Usually होता है कि कोई टीम तो चौथा ले रही होती है, मतलब राउंड में वो थोड़ा सा क्लियर हो जाता है कि ये टीम तो नहीं आएगी आगे. And what that allows you to do is then just save time. But what I'll say to you is what you're doing is correct. Like you shouldn't have like only one strategy. Sometimes a debate calls for clash by clash thing, and it can become much cleaner that way. But sometimes it can become much cleaner through a team by team thing. My thing is just like when the debate demands clarity, do the team by team thing. When it's just like clear that you guys are winning, and and you just need to resolve certain argumentation as opposed to like resolve certain tensions between benches, then just go for the clash by clash thing.
Makes sense. Just like a quick follow up on that, and this is more and might be too technical in terms of like structuring whip speeches. So after the extension, you get certain responses from the other side on your extensions. So your
Yeah.
whip speech should ideally start with dealing with the responses and then reconstructing your extension and then showing why it's important, and at last dealing with all the teams. Like
Yeah,
that's
so
how the idea.
that's ideal. I think that's ideal because I think the best tool that you oftentimes have if you're going CG or even if you're going like CO is like CG के लिए ज़्यादा होता है क्योंकि if CG member goes in, CO member has to do a lot of shit like excuse me. CO member is the most difficult speech in the format. It has to deal with a lot more stuff. Like it has to rebut CG, but it also has to rebut like the openings or like weigh against them, and then also introduce your own things. So you have actually it's the first time that somebody's competing with four teams. So oftentimes what CO member does is not really conclusively respond to CG's extension. It's always useful to point out towards the judge, like they didn't respond to our extension. These are the two throwaway lines that they said, and these are our responses. Our extension still exists. But I'd say just go one step further. One of the biggest things about rebuilding is not just realizing कि अगली टीम का rebuttal क्या है, but also preempting कि possible rebuttal क्या आ सकता है. You should always be asking yourself as whip when extension is going कि did they miss this, or basically you're also trying to judge their speech, right? You'll be like, Acha, is there a link missing here? Is there something missing there or there? And that's the gap you need to fill before you give the other whip the opportunity to point that out, because at that point you are screwed. At that point you have no ability to respond. So the most crucial thing is not really always कि उन्होंने response क्या दिया है, but also thinking about वो response दे क्या सकते हैं और क्या 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 miss हुआ है वो rebuilding होगा. But yes, rebuilding is the first thing that you do. Once you rebuild your argument, then you can just weigh. That's the easier way of doing it.
That answers it. Thanks a lot.
No problem.
And I have a question.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
Okay. Anya, you go ahead
No,
first.
you go ahead.
Okay, so like it's like I'm not sure, like it's a pretty much simple one, but just generally at member op, to what extent should you be like rebutting member government's case? Like,
So yeah, I think that's a good question actually. If your member gov वो जो दो rebuttal वाला rule है ना वो तो रखना ही है. Member op पे by the way दो rebuttal वाला rule रखना है. Member op पे लेकिन जो करना है ना वो ये करना है, and the strategic thing is integrate the rebuttals for openings necessarily in your case. You don't have the time to rebut them extraneously as well. उनको आपको integrate करना पड़ेगा अपनी extension में. Do respond explicitly to what closing gov member has said. So keep an eye out. Now, obviously, you can't get in depth into rebuttals, but pick out, like, say, if their arguments have like one or two premises, attack the premises, attack the most important bits of the argument, and be done with it. Your whip can come up with like new rebuttals about shorter points or like smaller points or points that don't matter that much. That's their job. That's what they're going to do. But yes, if I was member opposition, the two rebuttals that I'm going to give are going to be to closing government, so that at least judge ye na kahe कि यार इन्होंने तो respond ही नहीं किया, कितना unfair है, blah blah blah. So you don't want the judge to think that. Explicitly respond to them.
yeah, okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask that, like, in cases where the premise of your argument and the end goal of your argument is very similar to what opening is saying, so like usually probably in like social justice movement motions where like you're probably achieving the same kind of goals, so you're probably talking about the same thing, but like opening usually like talks about this end goal in a way where like they just like jump to that end goal and never actually explain how that happens, at which point you can obviously like tweak in your analysis and like tell how that actually happens. So like in that case scenario, because you know that this is like a very important chunk of, like in this debate, like something that's like an important argument in this debate, so like how do you make sure that like the analysis that you're filling in does get counted as important contribution A, but also how much do you like how much analysis do you need to like fill, and like how do you know that like this analysis is going to be good enough to like make it sound like this is the like this is something that we exclusively did, and also like how much time you should probably be like spending on it, because you're probably going to have like another not so important extension as well, but like this one is like a more important one, so like how much time you should be spending on this one.
Okay. I'll just give an example here of how you do this. I mean, like in that round, the judges went a bit berserk, but apart from that, like I think what we did in that round, like Hamza and I did, was fair, and that's what teams should be looking for. I think the first thing is वो पहली बात तो जो मैंने की थी वो की थी, which is like you need to explicitly flag to the judge. You basically need to बार just remind the judge कि भाई हमने ये बात किया है, ये नहीं इस तरह है, ये वाला gap में से हुआ है. How to tell if it's like a good mechanism? The same metric that I told you earlier on. If the reason that you're coming up with this is just that it's new, then it's not a good mechanism. If you have other reasons for it, any reason by the way, like any strategic reason for it, then it's good enough. Like then run it. And but also explain the reason. Don't just be like कि judge को पता होगा कि क्या reason है. Just explain the reason. Say कि this is the reason for why this is a crucial piece of analysis that they miss, and this is the hole that we plug. Now Hamza and I were in this Yale Ivy parcel quarter or whatever, and the motion was something to do with Amazon tribes basically taking up arms against illegal poachers and loggers, um, and we were going like CG, and the thing was we knew कि सबसे पहले तो आनी है OG से principal argument. OG ने कहना है कि अच्छा regardless of whether this, because that's the easiest thing for them to do, regardless of whether this works or not, what we are talking about is basically the right to self-defense in a scenario where the state doesn't give it and where they deserve it, blah blah blah, all of that sort of stuff. O comes in and says, look, this will escalate violence. Classic case of deadlock where OG is like talking about the principle. O is talking about a practical harm, but that's also a principal harm because they're saying, look, your community is going to be far worse off at the point at which this happens, because more war, blah blah blah, all those sorts of things. Now, we we did this thing where we were like, okay, we need to add in a mechanism for why like things become better. Because look, what's the best case scenario for government is what we asked ourselves. The best case scenario for government is these guys take up arms and the government and the illegal poachers just they don't escalate, they de-escalate as a response. ठीक है. अब ऊपर इसके बारे में थोड़ी सी बात हुई भी थी. उन्होंने कहा हुआ था कि जी देखें इससे डिटरेंस होती है. वो जो सिंपल सी बात थी कि यू टेक अप आर्म्स डिटरेंस होती है. ओ ने आगे कहा था कि लेकिन डिटरेंस तब होती है जब आपके पास सिमिलर पावर हो. आपके पास सिमिलर पावर ही नहीं होगी तो ये किस तरह होगा. हमारा मैकेनिज्म काफी सिंपल था, which is के what does the Brazilian government, for instance, care about the most when it comes to the Amazon? The Brazilian government wants to continue its exploitation of resources over there, and for it to do that, it needs to attract FDI. Okay? And that's basically us identifying a new stakeholder and saying, look, सबसे ज़्यादा important पता है कौन होंगे? जो legitimate companies होती हैं जो वहाँ पे काम कर रही हैं, वो इस government के लिए सबसे ज़रूरी हैं. जिस point पे वहाँ पे violence शुरू हो जाएगी, simply एक ऐसा atmosphere create होता है जहाँ पे business आप कर ही नहीं सकते. Because again, it's uncertain, right? Like you can't think about like maybe your logging operations don't work for like a month or so because violence has erupted. Maybe you get bad press because some of your employees were killed, or people who are working in your land and close by your land were working, and these firms will first face uncertainty. Second, what they will face is intense media scrutiny because their headquarters aren't in Brazil. Their headquarters are in Switzerland, the USA, and so on and so forth. अभी के लिए Amazon पे कोई रिपोर्टिंग नहीं करेगा क्योंकि न्यूज वर्दी नहीं है. At the point which tribes वहाँ पे arms लेके खड़ी हो जाती हैं, it becomes like a newsworthy thing. These newspapers will get ratings वगैरह वगैरह वगैरह, and that's why they will want to report on this, which hits the PR of these firms very badly. These firms already have a bad rep for being loggers, environmentally damaging, all of that sort of stuff, which already happens. So what we did over here was basically say like सबसे जरूरी एक्टर ये है, इन्होंने ये वाला मैकेनिज्म मिस ही कर दिया है, इसके बगैर डी एस्केलेशन हो ही नहीं सकती. यही वाला एक्टर अब ब्राजील की गवर्नमेंट को कन्विंस करेगा डी एस्केलेट करने के लिए, क्योंकि ब्राजील की गवर्नमेंट के पास और कोई चांस नहीं है. और इसकी वजह से हम ओपनिंग हाफ ना से हमने एक मैकेनिज्म दे दिया उनके क्लेम के लिए, हम ओपनिंग हाफ का क्लैश भी रिजॉल्व कर देंगे. ओपनिंग हाफ का क्लैश इस बात फंसा हुआ था कि राइट टू सेल्फ डिफेंस होना चाहिए या फिर जंग होनी चाहिए. हमने कहा था हम ऑपोजिशन की बात मान जाते हैं. Self defense is contingent on, let's say in the worst case scenario, self defense is contingent on you being able to protect yourself. This is actually the only way in which you're going to be able to protect yourself and de-escalate violence. So we're taking out OO's metrics. We're also giving up new material out like OG's missed this, and we're making a case. Now, अब judges क्या करते हैं इसके बारे में वो अलग है, but this is ideally how you should approach it, which is be very clear about the new stuff that you're bringing in. The argument remains the same. The outcome is the same as you suggested, but the analysis is clearly not only different, but also crucially the argument is our analysis making the argument stronger. The claim becomes stronger after you put our analysis in it, and that's what you should be aiming for.
Yeah, thank you.
If there are no more questions, then I guess this is when we say goodbye. Unless, obviously, questions go on.
How important is it to like spend 20 or 30 seconds during the start of your extension speech to just talk about the opening half? In the sense that OG says X, OO says Y, OG doesn't respond adequately to what OO says, so OG is pretty bad. And then start your extension.
I mean, if it's useful for your extension, go for it. If it's not, then don't. Um, if there is a genuine deadlock, then yeah, sure, go for it. Start your speech by explaining there's deadlock in opening. This is the deadlock. We are going to resolve it and go straight into resolving it. And I think that's the perfect kind of situation where you don't even need to do extraneous rebuttal. You're like, ठीक है इनका deadlock है मैं सीधा से extension में चला जाऊंगा. Like it's pretty important if you flag it. Like again, what I'm going to tell you is like simply like, let's say there's a debate structure, speech structure, जहाँ पे your extraneous rebuttals are coming in at 6 minutes. I really don't care. What you should start your speech off with is the most important bit of material in the round, and basically give as much time to it as possible. So if this is the most important piece of material in the round, go for it.
If there are no more questions, I think we're good to wind up the session.